Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our session. As you can see, it's who owns the data that trains AI and building user-owned AI economies. My name is John Lagman. I am a market and product specialist for Bloomberg, specializing more in like FX and crypto, but definitely this is one of the key thematics, of the last few years and definitely going forward. So, it's great to have you here. And obviously, I'd like to introduce our guest, Anna Kazlauskas. But I'll let her introduce herself. Anna?
Awesome. Thanks, John. Yeah, I'm Anna, co-founder and CEO of Open Data Labs, which is the research and development company that created Vana. I come from a background in both kind of machine learning. So I was training AI models. I'm at CSAIL, MIT's AI lab, always wanted access to data that I couldn't get access to, and then had gotten into kind of decentralized systems pretty early on through mining Ethereum, like back in 2015, part of the early MIT Bitcoin Club, and excited to chat more about Vana.
Actually, I saw that. I looked at your LinkedIn. I saw the MIT Bitcoin Club, but I guess although most of the sessions are probably more on crypto, we're probably focusing just on AI. But yeah, it sounded kind of cool. But yeah, let's just dive right into it. I mean, even if I just take the title of our session, obviously one of the big things about data and AI is who owns the data. Whether it's the input data or the output data. It's something that's been, I guess, argued both in the intellectual sphere, but obviously also in the courts. Have you seen in the last, say, I wouldn't just say 2026, maybe the last 12 months, have you seen more, I guess, whether court rulings or more intellectual kind of arguments trying to explain who does own the data?
Yeah, I think if you think about kind of creating AI, the core inputs are really data, compute, and research, right? And I think that compute, pretty clear who, it's like who's got the data centers, that's pretty clear. Research, sometimes it's open source, increasingly it's closed source. And then data is really becoming this kind of major differentiator. In terms of who owns the data, I think that a few years ago, people weren't really yet asking the question in terms of kind of like everyday consumer. And I think because AI has become so much more kind of widespread throughout people's, especially day-to-day work, people think a lot more about they might not think of it as who owns my data. It might be more like, where's the context that I need to make the AI work really well? And often when the context is hard to access, it becomes like a lot more challenging to then get AI to do what you want. And I think that has really driven a lot of consumer awareness around, hey, like, where is this data and how do I make sure that it's accessible? I think one interesting example, there's this note-taking application called Granola that kind of transcribes a bunch of your meetings, and they rolled out a change where they made it harder to access some of the data. They wanted people to go through their MCP. And there was just a huge amount of pushback, which I think we wouldn't have seen a few years ago, right? People increasingly are like, hey, I want access to my data. The other thing I would mention on the regulatory side is kind of increasing awareness of the importance of data portability, where portability is kind of the ability to take your data from one application, so say all of your ChatGPT history, and bring it into another application, right? So for example, Claude AI, or taking a bunch of your tweets and bringing it to a different social platform. And there was some new data regulation passed last year in Utah, the Digital Choice Act, which is really first of its kind data regulation enabling portability. So I think that while a lot of the terms like data portability or ownership might still be kind of a bit more intellectual, maybe starting to be more present in the policy sphere, I think that there is this broader consumer awareness of like, hey, if I want my AI to work really well, then I need to give it the right context. And that context is typically coming from a bunch of your data.
Yeah, actually, I'm having looked at a little at your company and stuff. I guess that data portability is actually very key for you, right? I mean, what I read obviously is that you're helping people access their other data into other platforms. I mean, I guess that the act in Utah probably is very key for you guys. Yes.
Yeah, that is kind of really key and helpful step really for kind of our user base and broadly consumers to be able to get their data really easily, right? If you look at the law, like similar to when you put your car in a parking lot, the parking lot doesn't own your car, right? It's your car, you can always go get it back. But you know when you go to the like parking lot and then they park your car like deep underground in a big city, and it's like really inconvenient to go get.
Yeah.
That's kind of how data is right now, right? Where you're like, oh, I want to get my data. Okay, wait 30 days, you get this inconvenient export, et cetera. And so I think that on the regulatory side, some of that work makes it just a lot easier for somebody to get regular access to their data and kind of be able to just easily port it across different applications. We also kind of build tooling that makes that easier as well.
Okay, cool. Maybe also, I mean, if you think of it, the second part of, I guess, our title, I mean, another, I guess, big kind of, have you seen a big shift from people when they're thinking about, what companies are looking at, user-owned AI economies and building that out? Do you find that it's now a much bigger decision rather than something that's kind of like a side topic about part of digital innovation or digital transformation?
Yeah, I think that increasingly people are just aware of like whose AI is this and where is my data going, right? I think even a lot of enterprises are thinking about, okay, I've got all this data from building up my business over the past few decades, right? If I give that data over to some AI company and then they train on it, they could really compete with me, right? And so I think that increasingly people are aware both of kind of the data and the important like knowledge and information that's represented in that data, and then how that kind of plays out from a downstream perspective within AI models and who owns those AI models. So I think we're increasingly seeing that. I do think right now that one of the things that makes AI work the best is just access to the frontier models, right? Everyone wants to use kind of the latest model release. I think that over time, yeah, you kind of right now we're in this phase where yeah, kind of models are still getting better and better. If you can have a model that's 20% better, you're going to choose that. I think that as data and context starts to be more and more of a differentiator, where maybe you have three different models that are all really quite smart, that can start to shift as well.
I see. Okay. One of the other things, kind of, if you want to think of it, a dilemma, I've always hear about is, with regards to reliability and observability. So if you want to think of it kind of correct but slow versus a fast but wrong, are you seeing, companies still kind of looking at the problem, maybe even the wrong way and stuff? And how are you seeing this kind of leading to, I guess, slowdowns or cost in production?
Yeah, I think that it can be really hard to kind of figure out like as a company, how do you use how do you almost like rebuild the way that you operate in an AI native world, right? And so I think that it's a lot of startups and smaller companies right now that are able to be super nimble, kind of figure out, okay, this is how we're going to use AI. This is how we're going to operate in a very native, a kind of AI native way. And I think it's honestly like still so early in the adoption curve, right? And so I think that's kind of changing over time. But it's still quite early from kind of an AI adoption perspective.
Okay. And then maybe with regards to like scaling, what is the first kind of non-negotiable design decision you would look for, with regards to integration, complexity, maybe dependencies?
Yeah, I think that I guess kind of through the kind of Vana technical design lens, like you got kind of a decentralized system for kind of data to operate on the network. So there's like a whole bunch of stuff going on there.
Yeah.
You have your traditional like L1 validators. Currently, our block times are about 6 seconds, which is,
Hmm.
I think, like we're specifically designed for data transactions. We're working on an upgrade right now that actually makes that much faster. That's a kind of performance improvement that I'm really excited about. And then there's also kind of what capabilities are built into the network from a compute perspective. So what sorts of operations can you run on the data? Um, Towards the end of last year, we added support for GPUs and kind of running these secure jobs on much larger GPUs. If you're
Hmm.
needing to do kind of full pre-training, et cetera, I expect to see like more and more of that from a technical requirements perspective. But I think it's also always a trade-off, right? And so one example I might talk about is we support kind of zero knowledge proofs around data. And in some cases, you are writing a proof of saying, hey, this is my data. It actually came from Amazon or Spotify. In the case where you're pooling your data with other people, it needs to be verified. But in some cases where you're using Vana for portability, like I'm taking my ChatGPT history into Claude, it's actually not worth me as a consumer paying the compute overhead to verify it because I'm just like using my own data, right?
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that having that kind of more flexible design kind of lets you get the best of both worlds, where when you need something that's slower because you need very strong verification, you can include that kind of data check. Whereas if you're using your data at the individual level, you can just use kind of the portability properties of Vana to be a lot more efficient.
I see. From a workflow perspective, the kind of end-to-end kind of production, I mean, where do you typically see like the first kind of material failure usually appearing?
Yeah, so I think that there are like, okay, depending on where a company is on it in its AI life cycle, like in some cases, it's like there are a bunch of machine learning engineers. This is in the case of self-driving. It's like a bunch of machine learning engineers have figured out if we had exactly this data, we could improve performance by this much. And they have a bunch of information to operate on, right? So they know we need this many hours of video data. This is how much it's going to improve our performance. This is specifically what we need. And that I think is often in the kind of much later phases, right? If we think about self-driving and autonomous driving, I mean, we were promised that like 10 years ago, right? And so that is like kind of much later in its AI life cycle. So I think that's one phase where it's like someone needs very specific data that is hard to get anywhere else. And often that's kind of later in the kind of technology lifestyle cycle of AI. And then on the other end of the spectrum, and I think this is kind of where LLMs and pre-training are today, even though there's like large scale text data, often it's just kind of figuring out like, okay, we need basically as much data as we can get with as much signal as we can get, right? And so in that case, I think that there is still kind of so much room for research around like how do you efficiently use this data. I think that a lot of the like cleaning data cleaning pipelines, even the ways that we train models are built around knowing, okay, we can get a ton of relatively low quality publicly scraped text data. And then we can get a smaller amount of data from human experts, right? That's kind of cases where people are hiring like lawyers and doctors to generate really high quality data. And that I think is a lot of what the research kind of is built around today. Just as assumption, those are the two kinds of data you can get. Small amounts of really high quality stuff that's very structured, and then this kind of large scale unstructured stuff that's very kind of much more mixed quality. I think that with the data that's coming directly from users, you kind of have this different kind of data, right? Where it's kind of not quite as specialized as hiring a bunch of very specialized doctors or
Lawyers or
something to do
something? Yep.
something,
Yeah.
but it's also much higher quality than just kind of your random kind of Reddit thread, right?
Yep.
And so I think that that's this really interesting space of kind of how do you train data? Like, what's the right way to work with this data? And that's something too that, yeah, we've spent time. I was talking to a researcher who was talking about like, so say you have a bunch of data. Often
Yep.
you need to kind of massage it in the right way to make sure that it's well represented. Like maybe you have way too many threads about coding related questions, but not enough threads about, say, like cooking related questions. So you kind of are doing this like process of resampling, et cetera, and kind of like massaging it in the right way. And some of those techniques are really specific to public data. And so I think there's a kind of like this whole other set of questions around like how do you properly clean this private kind of user owned data at scale? And there are also privacy constraints to that, right? Where like typically one of the kind of pools of data that's governed by the users on Vana, they have stronger privacy constraints, right? Where they're saying, yeah, you can run this training job, yeah, you can run this cleaning job, but there's a little bit more kind of a process to actually run that operation. So yeah.
I was just curious. I mean, I guess is the data massaging in a sense? I mean, probably
Yeah.
much bigger than most people think, I guess, right? Or
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that like so often, I like one thing I noticed with like really, really high quality researchers is they just like they care so much about the data. I mean, that's where you're really like that's the difference it makes, right? It's like if, I feel like it's similar to a great chef, a great restaurant. Like they care so much about the quality of their ingredients, right? If
Yeah.
you want to make an amazing meal, what do? You start with like really high quality ingredients. And I think that that's really true within AI too. Like you need really high quality data. And I think we're seeing this, right? Even with like the cursor acquisition, right? That's some very good telemetry data, right? I think there was something coming out around Meta having a lot of its sort of whole set of employees install something that's recording key logs, et cetera, right? And that all, yeah, you want better data. Like that's really what makes a difference.
Yeah, I mean, in my day job normally, I deal with a lot of like hedge funds, systematic, you know, data first. I mean, all your models, if your data is not, massaged, as you said, the ingredients is very key in how you store it, I guess, and how you pull those ingredients and things like that. So, okay, I mean, we've been talking about data, maybe with regards to say validating security, say kind of key management control and control health. Are there any kind of metrics that you feel that operators should at least consider or to review, either weekly or monthly or whatnot?
Yeah, I think that keeping your data safe is very important, right? And I think actually there have been some recent hacks. I mean, there was like the Merkur hack, right? Where that is like their fundamental kind of like enterprise value comes from the ability to gate whether or not someone has access to their data, right? You can only charge someone money for something that is not, I mean, maybe you could argue there's some licensing legal requirement, but like
Yeah.
generally what has played out in AI training data to date is that as soon as the data is public, it is very hard to charge for. And so because of that, privacy and security really becomes this really important problem. I think I'm also seeing it among, I don't know how much you've gone into the kind of like vibe coder rabbit hole, but like these days you can just build an app in like one prompt.
Yep.
I think that often there are some security trade-offs there, right? And so one thing we've actually started to see is kind of builders and vibe coders who want to build an application but are hesitant about kind of taking on a huge amount of security and privacy responsibility, they can choose to use Vana to have their users store their data directly, right? And in that case, you as an application builder, you don't need to worry about, hey, how am I securing all this user data that I actually am storing? Because you actually don't even have it, right? You're not the one storing it. It's the individual users who are storing it. So I think that increasingly we'll start to see what I see as kind of more of these like system level approaches to better security as AI just gets more and more powerful and can power a lot of kind of security attacks as well.
Let's say you're unable to dodge any kind of like latency or cost kind of benchmarks or issues. Failure handling under like degraded network conditions, things like that. Are there any kind of like operating type of adjustments that you think actually work, kind of whether temporarily or permanently in a sense? Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess from the Vana network perspective, every user kind of controls their own keys, right? So you've got your keys to your data, just like with kind of in a cryptocurrency context. If you have Ethereum sitting in your wallet, like your ETH is yours because your keys are actually what permission your ability to transfer it. Same thing for your data, right? You are the person who is able to decrypt your data, grant access to it. And that gives like a really strong kind of self-sovereignty guarantee. So I think that that piece of it is important from kind of like a network guarantee perspective, which is just your keys control your data, right? Just like your keys control your funds in a crypto context, with Vana,
Yep.
your keys control your data.
Okay. Say you're looking at, say, developer speed versus, say, platform safety. I mean, from your perspective, which of the two tends to win or it takes precedence? And is there some kind of threshold that tells you should switch from, say, speed to platform safety?
Yeah, I think that it really depends on what you're doing, right? So like there's a founder who's building like a women's health app, right? Which is tracking a whole bunch of women's health information. I would really recommend, I mean, they're taking a very security first approach, right? So they're like not going to say, hey, let's ship this overnight, right? They are going to
Yeah.
prioritize shipping it securely. And then maybe on the other end of the spectrum, I guess it just depends on what your application is doing and what data you're working with. And a lot
Yep.
of it is kind of using just sort of judgment of what is the downside scenario and how do we make sure that this is secure? And I would say too, like sometimes things that you might not think are that important are actually like quite important to secure. One example from a while back is like the time that Netflix released a bunch of their data for the Netflix prize, and people
Yeah,
figured out like, oh, if you know like one date that somebody watched a TV show, you can figure out their whole watch history, right? And that can actually be kind of sensitive, right? You could
yeah.
potentially even infer like where their location was, et cetera. And so I think that being mindful of that as well and just taking kind of security very seriously in this AI first world is super critical.
It's probably a tangent, but I was we wrote an article recently about how people were using it was more crypto related, and they were able to figure out where people were. And there's been like a slate of like people getting like kidnapped and forced to hand over their crypto
Yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, obviously, I was when you were saying that about Netflix, I was like, yeah, you don't want people to know where you are because unfortunately, certain people will do bad things with that. Unfortunately, that's
Yeah.
just the way the
No,
life is.
yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great example, like as dark as it is, right? In a
Yeah.
lot of these, if someone gets into your account, often it has your address in it, right? And your address is like something you probably want to protect. Same with your IP address, right? A lot of platforms are storing your IP address and logs of where you've logged in from. That's extremely personal as well. And so I think that sometimes when you think about kind of privacy and security, for like as a consumer, you just have data across all these different platforms that you've used, right? Because of the way that data is stored today. And some of that data where you're like, oh, I've just made an account and they just have my email. It's like, well, actually, they also have like your IP logs and maybe your address if they've ever shipped you something. And so I think really being aware of that. There's a tool that we put out called Data Connect, which allows you to really easily go and take your data out of an application. And I've seen some people where they're using it and then they're taking their data out of the application and then deleting their account, right? Because maybe they want to save the history, but it's also like they just kind of want to minimize their digital footprint. And I think we're going to see kind of more and more of that as people become just more aware of the risks.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that sounds great. Maybe we'll come, one last item, for our audience, if they're looking to go down the rabbit hole and stuff, is there kind of like I don't know, like a 60, 90-day action plan? You'd say, hey, this is the kind of things you should implement first,
Yeah, I think
besides
that
about
if you're coming from an AI kind of really AI native, like you're already in Claude code all day, et cetera, I think thinking about like what data do you need to get the right context, right? And then thinking about how do I get that and like how do I share that, et cetera. So that is kind of involving a lot of the data portability stuff on Vana. And then if you are kind of training models and trying to figure out just how do you stay competitive in this like AI native world, a lot of that is about figuring out kind of where in your kind of customer life cycle do you need AI and what data do you need to make the AI work well, right? And so sometimes that involves two pieces. It involves one, customizing an AI model to make it work well. So for example, you're kind of trying to predict this person who came in based on their kind of past purchases or listening history, what would be a good kind of match for them. But then there's also the aspect of have once you've got a whole bunch of data to kind of create those personalization models, letting someone just bring their individual user data in. So you're kind of both training on a large subset of data and then taking the individual data as well. And I think it's a super rapidly evolving landscape, right? It changes honestly every month or so, maybe even every few weeks. And so I think really just kind of staying up to date and trying things out, getting your hands dirty, really kind of setting things up, being like, does this actually work? Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you. And to the audience who stayed through, I hope you enjoyed it. I mean, I learned quite a bit. Yeah, and I guess hold on for the next session. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the questions. Really appreciate it.